Hello, hello. This is Aaron. We are Mondays with Mark, still in the somewhat strange and foggy lighting situation. That's all right. So today we are looking at the end of Mark chapter 9, kind of decided to move along with the lectionary text for the next little bit. So yeah, we're going to check it out. I'll just kind of give a review of what happened. Let me open this up. All right, so that's not it. Sorry. Anyway, I'll try to read it from here, but then I can't move it up. It's getting a little bit strange. Yeah, I don't know what's happening here. Sorry. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Wow. Okay, so just we finished off in chapter 9 last week. We talked a little bit about this, the way it ends here. But then right after the in chapter 8, the prediction of Jesus' death, and then the idea of his kingdom coming in power. Then you have the transfiguration scene, where importantly for our context, Jesus is referred to by God from the cloud as, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him." And then there's this conversation about Elijah that luckily we don't have to try to figure out because we're going to move on. Then also important is this healing of a boy with a spirit. They come down from the mountain. The disciples have been trying to heal this boy, and they can't. And so Jesus gets a little bit upset, but then heals the boy. It's important to note that the affliction is demon possession, but is causing the boy to be unable to speak. And so the idea of not being able to speak is also kind of brought up, just as the idea of blindness was a part of what we talked about last time, because of the healing of the blind man right before the disciples are kind of experience this different levels of blindness about who this is. So the idea that there is a healing of someone who can't speak right beforehand of a boy is, I think, important for what comes next. So here's the text that will be many people will be preaching about this week, from Mark 9, verses 30 through 37. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child, and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, embracing it, he said to them, Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. Yeah, so that's what we're going to get into today and talk about. And let me move that off the screen. So, a couple things to notice right away. Again, just as last week, in this tight little section here, starting at 8:22, where we were last week, there's multiple references to this on the way, and you may remember. Well, I don't expect you to remember, but way back at the beginning when we started talking about Mark, this idea of a way was introduced all the way back in chapter 1, and it is emphasized here in chapters 8 through 10, particularly as Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem. But the way becomes this metaphor for this particular living of the example of who Jesus is and what Jesus is calling us to. Dr. Blunt in his book Go Preach would say this invitation to preach the kingdom message that Jesus preached and to live the kingdom life that Jesus lived, to open up pockets of kingdom and God presence wherever we are. So yeah, that's what that language is about. And of course, the deep irony that these two sections give us is the idea that they are on the way, and on the way that Jesus is calling them down. They're preoccupied with who is the greatest among them. Yeah, I'm trying to think of where I really want to jump into this. I think that the important thing to really to get at is all right, sorry. Let's see here. Oops, I'm having some trouble here. Okay, so sorry, I'm having some trouble inviting, just like last time, I'm having some trouble inviting Mark in. So let me try again. So I think the big things I think that happen in this text that are interesting is, again, connecting with the previous healing story. Not only you have a child that's healed, but you also have this sense of silence and not being able to speak, and in the prediction of his death that Jesus gives, the one thing that the disciples, they don't understand, but they also are not willing to speak about it, to ask about it, to get their questions out. And then when Jesus asks them what they've been talking about along the way, they are silent. So you have that connection there between the demon causing muteness or silence in the boy, and throughout Mark, this kind of lack of understanding and unwillingness to speak or testify or witness shows a what Joel Marcus in his commentary calls a spiritual malady. That's a sign of a spiritual malady. So that's an interesting tie that happens in there. Another thing to note about the kind of irony that's taking place here as they go into Capernaum, which we learned in chapter 1 was where Peter was called from. The house they go into, if you remember, Jesus goes into the synagogue, I think, and then he comes out and ends up in the house of Peter, and then the mother-in-law is healed, and immediately she begins to serve. Right, she begins to serve them, and of course, this is the same language that Jesus will use about the disciples, and when he says that if you want to be great, you must be the least in the servant. If you want to be first, let me just read it right. Whoever wants to be first must be least of all and servant of all. Right. So again, that tie-in with it looks like Mark can't make it tonight either. Yeah, Marcy had to call out and Mark had to call out, so I got all alone here. But I'll try to make do here. There's just a couple more things I really wanted to get out in this anyway. So so the servant connection between Peter's mother-in-law, maybe even they're in the same house that where that scene happened last time, and then you have that connection between Peter's mother-in-law, who's healed and becomes a servant, and then the disciples seeking who is the greatest and being told that they must become servant of all. Some suggest that this argument about the greatest might have sprung up because of the transfiguration scene, where Jesus seems to kind of pick some favorites to go up the mountain and have this experience. Of course, they were not supposed to tell anyone about what happened, but we did. I think the whole kind of running thing in Mark is that when people are told not to do something, especially talk about who Jesus is and some revelation about Jesus, they seem to not be unable to hold their tongue. So maybe that sparked a conversation and debate among the disciples about who is greatest, requiring them to be told how that works by Jesus. I think it was Origen who first came up with that. The church father Origen first came up with that idea, and then let me just make sure that I. And then also, I think two other connections with the wording. Again, is in verse 34 when it says they were silent. That also echoes back to an argument that Jesus has with some scribes in chapter 3, where he heals on the Sabbath, and he asks whether it's good or right to save a life or to kill it on the Sabbath, and the leaders around are struck silent. They using the same wording that is used of the disciples here. So not a good comparison, right? And so now, just make sure that's. Yeah. there's maybe more to be said at some point about the idea of Jesus being handed over, and that language there. One thing I did notice from another commentator says John preaches and is handed over or delivered up, using the same language that Mark uses a lot. Jesus preaches and is delivered up or handed over. The disciples will preach and will be delivered up, as it suggests in chapter 13. So again, going back to this idea of necessity or inevitability of suffering, again, I think Dr. Blunt is correct in prioritizing the call is to preach. The call is to witness and to testify and to live the life of the way that Jesus is showing us. And because that will necessitate crossing boundaries, throwing up truth in places where it doesn't want to be heard, and asking people to go against the status quo, conventions, those sorts of things. It will be subversive, your way of life to some degree. That will bring on the reality of being handed over, being delivered up, being sent before some judgment or some punishment. So now, lastly, I think the only other thing I really would like to get into, which is the harder part of the text, is this idea of the child, where Jesus brings the child and sets the child on, brings the child and embraces the child before them. And we'll, going back to the text again, then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." Yeah. So a couple things about this. The interesting thing here is this is a little different than other texts, where other texts seem talk about having childlike faith or something like that, but asking us to kind of become the child. This one is very specific about asking us to receive the child in our midst, and receive the child in the sense of and being promised that receiving the child is a way of receiving Jesus, and receiving Jesus is a way of receiving God. I think that really is an interesting thing to think about. Is what does that mean? What did it mean for Mark's community? What did it mean in the context? What was Jesus asking them to do? It seems to be a very literal thing. Receive receive a little child, and there child language receiving children and not causing children to stumble will come up even later in chapter 10. But what does it mean? And I think one of the things that a couple commentators said, which I thought is interesting, is this who is it? Marcus, who talks about the Christology or Mark's understanding of who Jesus is. If you think about, also we have the context of the transfiguration that just happened, where again, in kind of a little more mystical and metaphorical way, God embraces Jesus as his own son. draws him in as his own and son by claiming, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him." And now you have Jesus embracing this child, and other commentators talk about this word used, paideon, for the child, echoes back to Exodus 2, where the people are adopted by God, and that embracing is also kind of a symbolic gesture of adoption, as well. So you have this interesting moment here of kind of the divine human kind of intermixing and flowing together in this text. Someone says it like this. Let me find, the question. So it's, the question of the interesting thing about the transfiguration is the acknowledgement that Christ represents God, where God says, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him." Then in this section, the question becomes, who represents Christ? So Christ represents God, shown in the transfiguration. In this section, the question is, who represents Christ? And the answer, one of the answers given to that in this section, is that the little child represents Christ. And the idea is to receive the child. And in receiving the child, you're receiving Christ and receiving God at the same time. It's a really interesting way to think about what the text is saying about Christ's presence for the community, about God's presence for the community. I think with what, the kind of the understanding of who the children were and how children were understood at that time, I think you have to think that, part of the impulse here is to say that, even kind of the most forgotten and vulnerable of people in the society, in the hierarchy that's set up, are people that we are to show hospitality to, or we are to try to serve and adopt and ensure their nurture and flourishing, because we are to be the servant of all. And of course, we don't need to be reminded necessarily to be servants to the people who we want a favor from, or who might be able to reciprocate our service with some kind of reward. We need to be reminded to serve those who we can't expect much in return from. This is so the child in this setting is one that Jesus says that we must receive the child as kind of an extreme example, or the one side of the coin of reminding us that we need to seek out and receive those who society has forgotten, who society has passed over, who are who so easily can be pushed aside and pushed to the outside. We need to embrace and adopt and bring them in. And again, this is the text is the story is interesting because you have the disciples who can't heal this boy right before this in the scene, and Jesus has to has to come and heal the boy. And it's kind of about this question about the disciples' faith, their ability to heal, the father's faith, where the father asks, I believe, help my unbelief, for the child to be healed. But this question of, the question kind of looms after this text of how important the disciples felt it was to heal a young child. Did they value that child? Did they receive that child that needed healing, even knowing all the traumatic stuff that the child was going through? It's and of course that leads us to ask the same question of ourselves. Who are we forgetting about, and how are we failing to receive the children in our communities, the children at the border, the children in other countries that are struggling? How are we failing to receive those children? Because I think it comes down to this, this different economy. What you're seeking to gain is more of God's presence, and it's available in receiving these children, in bringing these children in. And again, it if anything, it's going to cost you money and resources and patience and nerves and whatever. It's going to it's not, you may not gain anything according to the as far as wealth or prestige or whatever, but the economy is about accessing and being filled up with God's presence, with Christ's presence in your midst. And that is that's available in the reception of these children. Of course, there's echoes here of the Matthew 25 text that Presbyterians have been liking a lot lately, with the poor and those in prison and those without clothing or without food, and those being ministered to, and Jesus saying that was, you did that unto me when you did that. This idea of where Jesus is present in the vulnerable, in the children, in these places. So I think there's the balance here, right, of the prediction of of Jesus preaching and teaching and challenging the powers that be, and what that's going to mean for him, the disciples' inability to understand, and then this call to seek greatness or firstness or any aspiration that you have, to divert it from the normal avenues that are available to us, and direct it toward service and accessing God's presence more and more in our lives. I don't know how helpful that is, but that's what I got this week, and without my friends to help me along, that's where I'm at. I think we all can probably think of children in the world and in our communities that need to be welcomed and received, and think of ways that our faith communities can do that better, on a individual level, and then how maybe we can join together on a larger level and fight for things that would create a better situation for children. So anyway, cool. Next week we continue right after this with the text about someone else outside the fold healing people, and the disciples asking questions about that. And then not sure what happens after that, but I know that much. So yeah, I will see you all next week. Hope everything's going well for you all, and have a great week.